Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, bringing you the latest news from Taiwan. I'm Gladys Lee.
I'm Rath Wang. After years of Chinese intimidation in the waters off Philippines' west coast, the country is fighting back with buoys. With a boost in U.S. support for the island nation, we'll look at what this means for the region as tensions with China rise.
And joining us in the studio today, we have Professor Arthur Ding with us. He's a long-time military expert and professor emeritus at National Zhengzhi University. And we have Professor Huang Kuibo with us today. He is the renowned expert in international relations, associate professor of diplomacy, also at National Zhengzhi University. And we have Vincent Zhao. He's the Taipei City Consular and former director of the political division of Taiwan's representative office in the U.S. Warm welcome back for three of you.
Many military analysts say U.S.-Philippine military cooperation are at its best in decades. With that in mind, President Marcos Jr. recently set buoys in the West Philippine Sea, or commonly known as the South China Sea. Professor Ding, with all this support from the U.S., are we seeing the Philippines pushing back on Chinese claims?
Well, I would say the Philippines' attitude toward this issue has somewhat up and down in the past almost 10 decades.
Are we at
10 years.
an up point now?
Yeah. Before President Duterte, this is the Philippines which took the case, so-called, to the arbitration court in the 2012. Then in 2016, the arbitration court made a rule, and Beijing was not happy. But the time when the arbitration court made the rules, the Philippines has a new president. His name is Duterte. And Duterte is quite an orthodox leader. He is kind of a local politician. And he took a different approach toward China because he is alluded by the China's One Belt One Road programs. And China make overpromise to say provide some kind of assistance. So President Duterte made some concession, just put aside temporarily this so-called South China Sea issue. But the problem is that the China, as I said, China make overpromise but deliver nothing, frankly speaking. So in the late period, President Duterte, before he stepped down, Duterte has lots of complaints publicly towards China. So when President Marcos come to the office early this year, at the beginning, President Marcos visited China, and seemed try to build kind of somewhat a good relation with China. But the problem is again, China took the quite aggressive approach in several athletes in the Philippines. So we don't know why. Anyway, so President Marcos changed his attitude and visited the United States and had so-called 2+2 meeting with counterparts, Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State had the so-called 2+2 meeting. So the relation with United States get much better and warm up, and the relation with China has been cooled down. So I guess this is the background. Okay. So the President Marcos set the so-called buoys in the South China Sea, and to show its resolve and the will try to defend those claims made by the Philippines.
How much of this is from the U.S. in terms of the buoys here? Is there
For
support?
the growing confidence from the Philippines, right?
Yeah, I believe there has been some consultation between Manila and Washington on the management of the dispute in the South China Sea. However, although we don't know the real contents of these consultations between the two governments, but I tend to believe that the U.S. has promised to give the Philippines some more modern weaponry system that can help the Philippines defend part of the South China Sea areas. Meanwhile, I also believe that the U.S. has promised to offer more economic aid to Manila, which Manila always needs, so that Manila can be less dependent on the economic aid packages provided
so
by
hence the
mainland
confidence
China.
that we see here.
Excuse me.
So this is where the confidence comes in with the combination of economic and also weaponry.
Actually, you have to know that the Philippines still relies heavily on economic relations with the Chinese mainland. But at least the U.S. would like to offer some economic help to lessen the economic dependence of Manila on Beijing. So I think Manila would be welcoming this offer by Washington.
And Vincent, what does this mean for Taiwan? Do you feel that with the Philippines tilting more towards the U.S., is this beneficial to Taiwan's defense?
Well, I think Professor Ding was absolutely right, because you have to really look at this through the lens of what took place in the Duterte administration. And the Duterte administration was extremely special in the sense that when he came to office, he had this idea of how he would strategically balance the Philippines between Russia, between China, between the West, and he would formulate a more independent foreign policy. I mean, those were his words. And then he realized after the arbitration ruling that he really did not have the means to enforce Philippine sovereignty. I mean, he realized in the months and years afterwards that not only could he not enforce fishing rights, he could not enforce the Philippines EEZ. I mean, he acknowledged, I think publicly a number of times, that the Philippines is a small country. It cannot go against China. And so I think what the about phase came about was because he realized later on that without anybody behind the Philippines, without anybody supporting the Philippines, there was really nothing they can do to enforce their sovereign claims in the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea. And so this is partially the reason why I think Marcos Jr. came in with a much harder stance on China and with a much more, I would say, friendlier stance with the United States. And so when it comes to Taiwan, I will say this. I think the Philippines, its position towards China has changed tremendously over the past few years. We've seen sort of the era of hope and the era of I guess, friendship slowly give way to this era of a bit more mistrust and a tiny bit more hostility and a bit more assertiveness on both sides. And so in terms of Taiwan, I would say this. I would say that as we look at the regional situation, I think the Philippines, while it may not be able to do much more than it is already, but the steps it has taken to enhance the U.S. military presence kind of south of the Bashi Channel, I think would go tremendously towards ensuring that the U.S. is able to play a more capable role in enforcing peace and security here in the Pacific region.
But if we look back to the South China Sea, China also put the buoys on its own. So, Professor Huang, would you see the tension being rise or escalate in between the two nations?
The tension between Manila and Beijing on the South China Sea does rise a little bit to me because of the assertive measures undertaken by the People's Liberation Army or the militia vessels in the South China Sea. That's very obvious. However, I think both sides, I mean Manila and Beijing, have been trying quite hard to maintain some peaceful and stable and beneficial bilateral relations.
Still within control, that's what you mean?
Yes, controllable conflict in the South China Sea. For example, Marcos Jr. is the first foreign president who visited mainland China at the beginning of this year. And of course, he took a great deal of oral commitment delivered by Xi Jinping about helping the Manila's internal development, etc., which we have no idea whether or not Beijing is going to deliver later this year or later in Marcos' term. But the tension could be continue to rise given two major conditions. One is that the U.S. or the major U.S. allies are developing some explicit statements with the Philippines on the joint defense or joint protection of the South China Sea. So in addition to the U.S., I think Japan could be the one that fit in the role. And the second major condition that could rise the tension, increasing the tension between Manila and Beijing is the rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Although we have seen that, say, New York Times has predicted that the tension between Washington and Beijing could decrease at the second half of this year, but we have no clue. So just in case Washington and Beijing is in big rivalry and the rivalry increases, or the U.S. is organizing some quasi-coalition strategy in the South China Sea against the PRC, then I think the Philippines is going to get involved and its tension with Beijing will continue and probably even keep up.
Okay, Professor Ding, it seems like you have something to add on, right?
Yeah, if we look at the joint communique released by the White House after President Marcos visit the White House, U.S. promised to have some kind of a business forum in the coming years, and invite different government officials and the business executives to visit the Philippines. So U.S. In the joint communique, at least the President Biden did promise something related to economic assistance. I guess this is the major point that we need to know. Second is about also the joint communique also mentioned about the so-called mini multilateral so-called cooperation, for instance, between U.S., Japan, Philippines, and the U.S., Australia, Philippines, in the security or defense-related cooperation. So I guess this is the trend, initiated by the United States to try to expand more kind of a security cooperation for his ally and the partners.
So it's the start of a larger framework,
Yeah.
you feel, from multilateral to becoming multilateral.
Or mini multilateral.
Mini multilateral.
Yeah.
From the past times, we've also seen some submarines and other PLA vessels sailing into these disputed waters. Will this trigger a stronger Filipino response, Vincent?
I think the Filipino response is going to be limited by their capabilities. I mean, I think we see a very, very limited Filipino response in past incidents.
Yeah.
And certainly the idea that the Filipino Navy would be able to respond effectively and in a matter of deterrence to these incursions, I think, is a matter of, frankly, open debate. I think this would take time. We do see increased cooperation between the United States and the Philippines on Coast Guard.
Right.
Cooperation, particularly in areas of potential intelligence sharing and capability building, training, particularly in the multi-model format and so forth. And so I do think having the Philippines able to effectively respond to this will take years. But I think certainly this is the direction that the Filipino government has chosen to undertake. And I expect that their modernization campaign of their Coast Guard and Navy are directly in response to these Chinese actions.
We're curious, actually, if the Philippines commit to a larger security role in the first island chain. The topic can come back to talk about it. So Rath spoke earlier to Patrick Cornan. He's the Asia Pacific Security Chair at the think tank Hudson Institute, based in Washington. So now let's hear what he says about President Marcos Jr.'s harder line on China.
Patrick, is the Philippines getting tougher on China, as we've seen with the Philippine Coast Guard and the South China Sea with the new buoys, since President Marcos Jr. returned from Washington?
President Marcos has brought a much harder line on China than his predecessor. I think the buoys that you allude to are a good indication of what China is doing in the South China Sea. That is, they're trying to perpetuate control through customary international law, by essentially the daily administration of their actions for law enforcement, for fishing, and for their military operations, to make that the new normal and also effectively the law. Philippines has cottoned on to that. President Marcos understands this. And he's garnering support, not just from the United States and Japan, but from other countries, even far afield. The Czech Republic, for instance, recently coming down squarely on the side of the rule of law in the 2016 tribunal ruling in favor of the Philippines, for instance. So President Marcos is gathering all of this support so that he can have a better lever to press back on China's encroachment.
With all the support, do you feel China will retaliate?
China is trying to move on two parts of this pincer movement. One of them is physically moving forward the pressure, the forces, the engagement of their own three militaries, the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Maritime Militia, in order to create a physical presence around disputed islands, rocks, and waters in the South China Sea. And at the same time, they're trying psychologically to demonstrate that this is an inexorable trajectory, that Philippines and others must acquiesce to Chinese demands. So will they escalate against the Philippines? Well, if they feel that they can quickly suppress any kind of Philippine attempt to block or to thwart Chinese assertiveness and encroachment, the Chinese will escalate. If it entails a direct confrontation with a U.S. platform, they would calculate that in a different way and be very cautious, I suspect. But that doesn't mean they won't at some point escalate even against U.S. forces trying to protect the Philippines, especially if they feel that the United States lacks the political will to back up their forces in the field. And I think that would be a miscalculation in general, but we'd have to see the particular context of a crisis to know whether China's calculation seemed safe or reckless.
With China's unabated encroachment, we've also seen South Korea, we've seen Japan, and the US boost their ties in addition to the Philippines. What does this mean for the region? And what does this mean for Taiwan?
Well, Japan has been on this path for some time to essentially strengthen the spokes of the hub and spokes alliance system that the United States set up after World War II. South Korea, under President Yoon, has vigorously embraced this concept of an Indo-Pacific strategy and is seeking to make sure that South Korea matters not just in arms sales, it wants to be one of the largest arms seller in the world, but also in providing capacity building, technology, and education and training for Southeast Asian countries, for the region in general, and for cooperating with Australia and Japan and India and others. So this is where President Yoon has shown that Korea really wants to be this pivotal. I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3. And President Yoon has shown that he wants South Korea to become this pivotal state in world affairs. And I think that's showing up in the region in terms of defense and security support for Southeast Asia, as well as U.S. traditional allies like Japan and Australia.
We've also seen the G7 issue a joint statement, the strongest yet, on Taiwan in maintaining peace. What does that mean for China?
Well, there were several takeaways from the G7 meeting that I think were notable, and I would contrast the very strong affirmation of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait as a global issue with the fact that President Zelensky stole the show to some extent, and there was a very strong affirmation of the connections between European security and Asian security, and that these are indivisible. And I think that's the biggest takeaway, which is that America and its biggest allies and the richest countries in the world and the biggest democracies in the world are of one mind that peace must be maintained, and that any forcible unification or strong move to coerce a country, like Ukraine, or to coerce Taiwan would be unacceptable. And so Europe would be threatening sanctions, and America with its Asian allies would be prepared to block and thwart and stop aggression, but also to help Taiwan with its self-defense. And I think that is a significant declaration that the Chinese are taking very seriously, and it helps with the at least short-term deterrence of conflict across the Taiwan Strait.
Welcome back to the show. Professor Huang, I understand you did an episode on the 4 new bases in the Philippines that the U.S. is able to use. What does this mean for the regional security here in terms of the U.S. leading? We see Taiwan coming into the picture.
I think first we can see a great determination of the U.S. in terms of finding more new military bases, even though they are small, in order to enhance U.S. presence in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the South China Sea, or in the water area that's close to the Taiwan Strait. And second, we also see a strong resolve of the Philippine government that show the Philippines' greater willingness to work with Washington to reinforce its protection in the South China Sea. So I think these 2 points would worry Beijing a little bit, because as we have discussed, when Duterte was president, the Philippines wouldn't have done that. So in addition to Washington's resolve and Manila's resolve, I think also the 4 new bases would serve as frontiers for the U.S. in not only to monitor the military activities in part of the South China Sea, but also in part of the waters closer to the Taiwan Strait. So I think it's like double effect of these new 4 military bases in the South China Sea. And also you can see Beijing's response is actually not hard, not great. So to me, I think Beijing's response is under some self-restraint. Beijing did show its discontent toward the decision made by Manila. But however, I think Beijing's major target is on Washington, not on Manila. So you can see most of the blame given by Beijing was directed towards Washington. So I think in the short term, we're going to see this continued practice of the Beijing authorities towards these U.S. Philippines cooperation in the South China Sea.
But with its discontent directly seen at Washington, not towards the Philippines or other countries. And Vincent, did you want to
let me
add?
jump in here. I mean, I think Beijing's going to be very, very careful, like Professor Huang said, to avoid pushing Manila any further into Washington's camp. And I think to a certain extent, Manila has always been quite careful as well. I mean, I was recently in Tokyo for a multilateral meeting, and there are representatives there from regional countries that had mentioned that these aren't bases, these are sites. And I think the main use for these sites are to enhance deterrence and stability in the South China Sea region and not necessarily the Taiwan Strait. So I do think it's a positive step in the right direction. I think it's too early for us to draw really top-line conclusions about how much the Philippines could potentially contribute in the sense of maintaining stability and security here in the East China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. But I do think it's a step in the right direction. I will say this. I think the U.S. is very intent on ensuring that both the Miyako Strait as well as the Bashi Channel would be under its control. Control meaning that it would be able to avoid these two areas becoming potential flashpoints for the PLA if they were to try something on Taiwan. And so I do think that the U.S. strategy in the Philippines is to gradually build up to that and to ensure that it has a credible presence in the North Luzon Island, south of the Bashi Channel.
That's also why we saw the largest Balikatan military exercises in decades. Do you feel that was just to reinforce that it will control the Bashi Channel if something happens?
Well, don't forget, I mean, the Balikatan exercises actually had contained a number of other elements as well, including Australian military capabilities and others as well. And I think the key idea is that, number one, this area does require international attention. It's not simply this conflict between the United States and China. It's really this idea of China threatening the international world order and particularly regional stability, which impacts us all, from the Philippines all the way to Australia to Japan and Korea and so forth. But also, second of all, is like you said and like I said, which is to ensure that the U.S. is able to rapidly be able to deploy capabilities in the Miyako Strait, in the Bashi Channel, to deter these two areas from becoming potential staging points or potential access points for the PLA if some sort of worst case scenario were to break out here.
Bringing other countries in, indeed. During the G7, with its summit in Hiroshima, the G7 issued one of the strongest joint statements to date on the importance of maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait. The group also mentioned that it opposes any change in the status quo by force. Professor Ding, how effective will the statement be in terms of deterring Chinese aggression on Taiwan?
I guess there's a trend in the past several years that the Taiwan issue become more and more internationalized. Internationalized means that the future of Taiwan or the Taiwan Strait become a issue of concern for not just several countries, become a global issue. So I guess this kind of a wording and the statement reflect this trend, that the growing internationalization of Taiwan issue. And we also know that the so-called Indo-Pacific or East Asia has become the focus of the worldwide economic development. It become the worldwide engine. So any kind of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait will bring an extremely negative impact on the world economic development. Not just the so-called IC chips is, I would say, it's kind of a worldwide economic disaster, I would say. So that's why the G7 has such a very strong wording on the so-called peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And I think this is also reflect the trend in the past several years, because we see, not just G7, in any kind of a joint statement between United States and the EU and the NATO and the regional country in the Korea and the Japan, so on and so forth, we see this kind of a wording statement is in almost every statement. Yeah. So I think this is to show the importance of the Taiwan Strait.
Okay. So apart from force that we've actually talked about, the joint statement that actually Rath mentioned also oppose economic growth or something cooperation. Professor Huang or Vincent, do you think this will make China think twice, that actually it will affect Chinese economy later?
You mean the G7 joint statement?
Yes.
I don't
Apart
think,
from the force.
Yeah, I don't think that would generate a lot of counter forces that would deter mainland China from doing whatever it wants economically, because mainland China is capable of doing something in the Taiwan Strait that can hold Taiwan from doing something Taiwan really wants.
Okay.
And also G7's comprehensive power, I would say, is not as strong as it used to be before.
There, right?
So I think we feel happy that these Western countries do pay some attention to the urgency in the Taiwan Strait. But I think in addition to this wording conflict, in addition to this economic potential skirmishes between the G7 countries and mainland China, I personally also hope to see some diplomatic or political dialogue between the two sides, so that their tension over the Taiwan Strait or over some key political issues can be eased, so that Taiwan can be benefited from this kind of political diplomatic dialogue between G7 and mainland China.
What's interesting is that right after the G7 issued the statement, I'll ask you, Professor Ding, China actually sailed its Shandong, its second aircraft carrier, through the Taiwan Strait. What message, is this a defiance to the G7 statement?
Well, I guess this is kind of maybe it's kind of a coincidence. Frankly speaking, I don't know, but we know that China has its plan for naval operation. So I guess there's a saying in China, you play your way, I play my own way. 你打你的，我打我的。So that on the one hand, Beijing knows quite well the G7 statement, but on the other hand, there's a need for PLA Navy to do some kind of planning and the training, so on and so forth. So I guess the Shandong aircraft carrier passing the Taiwan Strait, I would say this is kind of a coincidence, not necessary to be kind of the backlash against the G7 statement. Yeah.
Okay, so actually we talk about the Philippines, and Vincent and Professor Huang mentioned about Korea or Japan. Another country that calls our attention is Vietnam. So actually we've seen a thread, a fine line between China and the U.S. as it also talks about the U.S. in elevating ties. So Vincent, in your opinion, Vietnam, would it has different response than or from the Philippines?
Vietnam's a really interesting case study,
Yes.
because they're also a communist government that has robust linkages with the CCP. However, their public opinion is actually quite anti-China, and we've seen the results of that through several riots that the people of Vietnam have conducted in industrial sites against companies mainly owned by China. Actually, every time those events take place, we're always quite apprehensive, because we get mistaken, our businesses get mistaken for Chinese businesses, and they get burned and trashed as well. So it's been sort of a problematic situation, but I would say Vietnam is in a quite difficult situation in terms of their own public opinion. Case in point, there was just this recent issue about Chinese ships coming into Vietnam's EEZ, very close to these gas fields that they jointly run with the Russians, and they've asked these ships to leave, and these ships have refused to leave. And in fact, the PRC has come out. I think their foreign ministry came out and said that no, they're traveling within Chinese sovereign territory, sovereign jurisdiction, and so therefore there is no need to leave. And so I think issues like this, territorial disputes, particularly over sovereignty in the South China Sea, I think are really going to be a flashpoint. And I say unique because I don't think the Vietnamese public opinion is going to give their government any room to back down on that. And so I do think over time we'll see the Vietnamese go further into kind of a friendlier relationship with Washington and potentially working with other regional partners to deter Chinese expansionism in that part of the world.
But do you think eventually Vietnam will be forced to pick side?
I think they're already picking sides right now, to be frank, and I do think this trend continuing, and I think that Vietnam has probably realized at this point that have more to gain, whether in terms of security or economically, by working together with the US and with Japan and other like-minded partners. Well, for them, maybe not so like-minded for us,
right.
Like-minded partners in the region, but definitely partners that have a common interest in deterring Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea, as well as in the ASEAN region.
Professor Huang, apart from the G7 that we all mentioned in terms of being from the West, and that you mentioned that its power is diminishing, there's also AUKUS that's closer to Taiwan. How effective do you feel that will be in terms of making Xi Jinping think twice before taking any military action?
The formation of AUKUS is obviously a tool for the U.S. to monitor the development of the PLA and also to counter the expansion of the PRC in the Indo-Pacific region. So AUKUS, regardless of the nature, is seen as a military cooperation, tacit understanding or dialogue network among these three countries. For Beijing, I think probably the weakest link, it's not the official term, but the weakest link could be Australia, because Australia's, also needs some more economic and trade interactions with Beijing, and Australia's current cabinet is very different from its predecessor. So Australian government now is probably seeking some balance between Washington and Beijing. Of course, if Australia needs to take side, Australia would lean towards Washington.
But do you feel the submarine deal could be a game changer for Beijing?
If the general context changes, and if the economy of Australia got hit by something, or so Australia might have to reconsider its military initiative with the U.S. in terms of these nuclear submarines. So for most of the Australians, I think these deals are very much good for Australia for now, for the time being. But what about in 5 or 10 years when the submarines are not ready made, but also, but in the same time, Australia is having some, say, economic difficulties or political difficulty with Beijing. So I think the project, I would assume, will continue. But when these subs are offered to Australians, I actually cannot predict the general military strategy context in the Indo-Pacific. But I think once Australians are having nuclear submarines, then the military or strategic context in the Indo-Pacific will change. That's for sure.
So we'll come back to talk more on U.S.-led collective security. And earlier we have Brett, who spoke to Stephen Nagy, and he's a visiting fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs and Politics and International Studies professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo. Nagy is also senior fellow at the McDonald Lawyer Institute and fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute.
Professor, as the AUKUS meeting just concluded in Australia, how is the AUKUS Security Alliance working towards containing or preventing Chinese expansionism in the region?
Well, AUKUS is a three-part agreement. The first part is about AI and quantum computing cooperation. The second part is cybersecurity and hypersonic missiles. And the third part has to do with deterrence capabilities, in particular nuclear-powered submarines, which provide long-term, deep deterrence capabilities between the United States, Australia, and the UK. The idea behind the enhanced deterrence capabilities is really to push back against Chinese assertive behavior in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and across the Taiwan Straits. It's meant to punch a hole in the anti-access, anti-denial missile systems that China has invested heavily in across the Taiwan Straits. And it's really meant to bring more stability to the region by demonstrating that this partnership is anchored to the region. I must say, though, that the nuclear-powered submarines and the deterrence capabilities that it brings to the region is important, but so is the cooperation in terms of AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity, and hypersonic missile systems. The three partners understand that these technologies will shape the region's economies, the relationship between government and citizens, and the new technologies that will emerge, in particular military strategy and others. So it's a comprehensive agreement that has a deterrent side, but also a proactive side that's going to try and shape the rules and the economies of the region going forward.
Professor, you talked about AI, and Taiwan has been seen as an expert in this area. Do you feel Taiwan could contribute directly to these conversations with AUKUS?
Well, without Taiwan's semiconductors, those top-tier semiconductors that provide the platform for the calculations that go on in AI or artificial intelligence technologies, the partnership wouldn't be as effective. So in many ways, Taiwan's role in being a stable provider of top-tier technologies such as semiconductors makes it a critical partner in some of the discussions and some of the planning for the region. I foresee Taiwan's role is working with like-minded countries and partners like Japan, South Korea, the United States, Australia, and perhaps the Netherlands in terms of safeguarding the semiconductor production technologies and the human capital behind that. I see Taiwan as an important partner in terms of continue to develop the top tier semiconductors. And three, really enhancing its own domestic abilities to keep the top tier human capital that Taiwan has developed in its semiconductor industries at home and not being poached by nearby countries to help develop their semiconductor industries.
Speaking of Japan, you're an expert in the country and based there. How do you see Japan work with AUKUS and other US allies in deterring Chinese aggression towards Taiwan?
Well, Japan continues to send the strongest of signals to Beijing that a forced reunification is not something that it's willing to accept. And it continues to talk about peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. And it's investing in enhancing its own defense and deterrence capabilities, as we've seen in the recent national security strategy that was released in December 2022. In that national security strategy, it talked about the acquisition of 500 or more Tomahawk missiles to be used as a deterrent. It stresses the importance of Taiwan in its security calculus, and we've seen it use its diplomatic resources to really put Taiwan on the map. And the G7 statement that just came out is a very good example of that, where Japan, working with the other G7 members, have explicitly said that Taiwan's future is of interest and it's of global importance, and that Taiwan is a global public good that they want to ensure remains peaceful and that the issues across the Taiwan Strait remain stable.
These are encouraging signs indeed. But do you feel that Japan is doing enough given how fast the PLA is mobilizing?
Well, Japan has constitutional limitations in terms of what it can do with its self-defense forces. There are questions of whether Taiwan or Japan can directly engage in a conflict that potentially could occur between Taiwan and China, and how they would engage. These discussions really are important starting points for how Japan thinks about preserving the peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. It values Taiwan because of its democratic institutions, their history, the good relations that Taiwan has continued to develop with Japan, but also it understands Taiwan's importance in terms of security within the region and being part of the first island chain, and of course its role in semiconductors. So Japan has a lot of interest with regards to Taiwan, and I think that it's going to work hard with the United States, Australia, Europe, and as I mentioned, the G7 partners and more to try and send the strongest of message and signals to Beijing that really peace and stability and a peaceful evolution to the relationship in between Taiwan and China will be the best way forward in terms of maintaining peace and stability across the region.
Japan has also recently spoken to another neighbor of Taiwan, the Philippines, in terms of security and with increased cooperation. How much of deterrent will this be to Beijing?
Well, the Philippines is a platform for the projection of power of the United States. And I think that's how we should understand the Philippines. We also should understand the Philippines as being an important partner in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Studies Nations, and its ability to work seamlessly with those countries to bring them on board to try and develop a code of conduct within the region will be important in terms of dealing with South China Sea related issues and China's assertive policy. But I don't think we should really expect the Philippines really to be a significant military partner. Rather, it's a logistics hub. It's a place where perhaps Japan and the United States, and maybe Australia, perhaps India, will be able to use as a platform for the projection of defensive power within the region to ensure that China doesn't use a might of right approach to solving the challenges that exist within the region.
Given that there seems to be rising tensions between both sides, the US allied side and also the Chinese side, how do you feel Taiwan should work with its like-minded allies and partners to make sure that China doesn't make the first move vis-a-vis a Chinese invasion on Taiwan?
Well, discipline, discipline, and discipline. And I think if we look at polls in Taiwan, the majority of Taiwanese people are happy for the status quo to continue. Very, very, very few people really advocate for the reunification with the mainland anytime soon. But they understand that their independence, their political system, their freedom to express themselves is all at risk. And as a result, I think a disciplined approach to messaging about what kind of political entity Taiwan is, the strength of its democratic institutions, and how it shares many values and institutions with countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, countries in the EU, Canada, the United States. This disciplined in messaging is going to be really important. At the same time, I think that Taiwan does need to enhance its deterrence capabilities. The Ukrainians, in their defense against Russia's invasion, has provided a lot of lessons, not only for Taiwanese, but how friends and allies of Taiwan can bolster the defense capabilities of Taiwan so that they can deter a potential forced reunification with China. These are important, but I think ultimately the Taiwanese people are going to have to think about what is in their interests. And in their interest is really maintaining that peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits, to not be the next Hong Kong, or not to be under the control of the Communist Party of China.
President Biden has been actively meeting with the presidents of South Korea and the Philippines. He then went on to the G7 and to the Quad, and even had his administration sign a new deal with Papua New Guinea. Professor Ding, what is behind Biden's motives?
Yeah, I would say President Biden is probably the most active president dealing with foreign policy in the United States. We see he has traveled to so many continents and participated in so many conferences and meetings. I guess, the day when President Biden took the office, he laid out his foreign and his overall strategy dealing with the global situation. The first one is build up and the investment in the United States. So we see so many infrastructure projects, so on and so forth. Second is about to try to bring back those older allies and their partners. So we see AUKUS, we see Quad, we see the U.S. Korea, U.S. Japan, and the U.S. EU. So many frequent and across the board meetings, I would say. So I think this is the overall strategy taken by Biden administration to deal with rise in China, because in his predecessor, President Trump, actually he almost alienated many of his former partner and allies members. So President Biden took tremendous different approach. So bring back, and I would say he has been quite successful in the past 3 years. So I guess this can explain why he has been so active in participating in so many meetings and signed so many statements, communication, and so forth.
Professor Huang, in terms of this overall strategy in countering Chinese expansionism, do you feel there's a focus on the first island chain?
Of course, the first island chain has been always the main focal point of the U.S. administrations. However, I think in recent years, the second island chain is gaining more and more weight in terms of U.S. general strategy in the Indo-Pacific, because the first island chain actually is more fragile in terms of when you see a growing power of the People's Liberation Army, who has become capable of penetrating the first island chains as it wishes.
And this would be out of Guam.
Yes, out of Guam. So out of Guam, and also PNG, Papua New Guinea, and some other second island chain related countries, then become more important.
Yeah, and then speaking of Taiwan, we just relieved the delivery of Stinger missiles from the U.S. and it says it's actually as part of the U.S. $500 million presidential drawdown aimed arms aid. How do you think this effective are these against Chinese military movement?
Well, to be honest, the Stingers are great because they're very much the definition of asymmetric capability. I mean, they're inexpensive, they arrive in large quantities, and each one of them could potentially take down a helicopter, take down an airplane. In fact, I think they can shoot down most things below 11,000 feet, which covers, I think, a lot of the capabilities we could potentially see in play here. And so it's very much a fire and forget weapon. So one person could hold it and one person can shoot it. I mean, it's partially the reason why I think the Soviet Union ended up losing the war in Afghanistan back in the 80s. But I will say this, I think that as we think about regional capabilities, I think as we think about G7 and what Japan and what Australia and what other countries are doing, it's really the most important country in all of this is us, is Taiwan. And what are the steps we're taking? And are we taking effective steps to modernize our capabilities? Are we making a fast enough transition to asymmetric? Are we getting new capabilities, including the Stingers, but also inclusive of others like smart mines, more anti-naval assets and anti-naval missiles and so forth? And so, I think it really comes back full circle to us. And so I think and hope that as we run into a presidential election, and certainly as we face a change in government, regardless of who wins, each party would continue to focus really stringently on the area of defense. Even I think if different political parties have different ideas of how to conduct cross-strait, I think defense is the largest consensus within our country. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to not only welcome the delivery of such asymmetric capabilities, but also continue to work with our armed forces for overall reform of our military and enhance our defense and security cooperation with like-minded partners such as the United States.